Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be here with you today. I know Tom and Joe have to be elated after the come-from-behind victory last night for the Patriots. Unfortunately, I'm on the other side, maybe like a few of you, where I grew up just a little south of here. And, when you cross over the border into Maryland, Cecil County is sort of like the dividing line. If you live there, you don't know if you're supposed to look to Baltimore or look to Philadelphia. But I lived really close to the border of the Susquehanna River, and so almost everybody looked to Baltimore. So yesterday was a grieving day for us. After last week, which was such a celebration. So it's so good to be here. In a lot of ways, coming to Eastpoint feels like coming home to me. Like I said, I grew up just across the border here. This is the third time I've been here to be able to share with Eastpoint. It's the first time here in this building. And we're so close, in fact, today that my parents could come and join us, and they're sitting right up here, so I'm glad to be able to see them. But why I'm here today is not just because I'm from around these parts, but as Tom mentioned, I serve a network of churches called the Ecclesia Network, and I'm really here today to bring you greetings and to welcome and say that we are excited to be journeying with Eastpoint on the mission of God in North America. Eastpoint and Ecclesia have been kind of friends of each other's for quite a long time, and over the course of this past year, we decided, I guess, to make that friendship official, of Eastpoint becoming part of Ecclesia, and Ecclesia saying we want to walk in mission together along with Eastpoint. And the irony in all of that is that Ecclesia actually started at Eastpoint in late 2007 at a pastor's meeting, and nobody really knew at that time, not even me, that would turn into, several years later, a nationwide network of mostly non-denominational sort of churches. And so just today, I come to say on behalf of churches from, Miami, Florida, Rhythm Church in Miami, Florida, to Evergreen Community in Portland, Oregon, to Kairos Church in Los Angeles, and many in between, that we love Eastpoint. We've been so glad to know about what you're doing and the purposes that God has for you here in the Newark area and around the world, and to journey with you. And I will say, in all of the areas that I sort of touch on in my life, I am just in touch with just hundreds and hundreds, if not in the thousands of churches. And you guys have some of the best pastors that I know. And so I hope that week by week that you remember what a gift you have in the leaders that God has brought to Eastpoint. And they're really wonderful people, and we're so excited to be able to journey with them. Now, Tom told me I could talk about anything that I wanted today for as long as I wanted. I'm going to do the first, but not the second. And you might be expecting me to talk about church and mission and those sorts of things, and that's what I find that I talk about a lot. But today I actually want to do something that really most Christians in the world are focusing on today. Because it's the season of Epiphany. And in case you've never heard of that, it's a time of year in the Christian calendar which starts with Advent and moves into Christmas. And Epiphany comes after Christmas. And it's the time of year where we're supposed to take several weeks to get reintroduced to Jesus. Now, that's really kind of not a bad idea, right? I mean, somebody a long time ago said, gosh, we sure forget who Jesus is and what he's doing so quickly and so easily. Maybe we need to ensconce in the space of time every year, time just to be sure we reorient ourselves to who he is and what he's doing. So I want to look at a story today in John chapter 2 because it's basically the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It's the story of the wedding in Cana of Galilee. Before we jump in there and I read that text, I just want to show you this. These are my kids. That's my daughter Eliana and my son Jace. They're 4 and 2. And normally they would be with everybody would come in tow today, but it was just a little too much with being all day yesterday and here. So, but they all would love to be here. And last time we came a couple times last year when we actually were living in Maryland, and every time my daughter would come up and try to play the drums afterwards. And she just loved coming to Eastpoint. So let me, if you have a copy of the scriptures, let's read John chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana of Galilee, and Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus said. "My time has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you to do." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," so they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He didn't realize where it had been come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." This, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed at Cana in the Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. I used to be a pastor near Virginia Tech in a college town, and for people who didn't know the Bible, this was always one of the stories that they were surprised was in there. And it's a strange story in a lot of ways, because we have Jesus turning some water into wine. Now, we're in football season, right? And so we're coming up a couple weeks on the Super Bowl here. And when you think about sort of the span of Jesus' miracles, right? The resurrection is like Super Bowl Sunday. But this feels like, it's like preseason training. I mean, water to wine, not even too many people know. I mean, in a little bit, Jesus is going to restore sight. He's going to cause a lame person to walk. He's going to feed 20,000 people out of a few loaves and fish. He's going to raise the dead. This feels like he's just kind of like, he's got to kind of working out his God power, testing it out a little bit. But it's a strange miracle because as far as I'm aware, Jesus has never done this one since. Although I'm pretty sure there were some people at the hotel I stayed at across from UD last night that were hoping he might show up and do this for them. Think about it though. In the course of church history, we know, and even today, situations where sight has been restored, cancer's been vanquished. I am aware of people that have been raised from the dead by the power of God, and never again has anyone claimed to see this happen. So how are we to understand this miracle? Well, we get a clue there in verse 11 at the end of the story, when John, the author of the story, says that this is the first of many signs that Jesus performed in Galilee, and it caused the disciples to put their faith in him. As a matter of fact, this is the first of 7 signs that are recorded in the book of John. So the question, of course, is what do signs do? Well, signs point to something beyond themselves, or they're a landmark for something that's coming in the near future, but you don't see it yet. Or they give us instruction about something that we're supposed to do, right? So, for instance, if you were to see this sign, you're going to throw that first one up there, Lucas. If you were to see this sign, first of all, you would know that you're not in Delaware or Pennsylvania, right? You would know, hey, probably soon there's going to be a moose or elk coming across your way, or at least you better watch out for it. If you saw this sign, like I saw when I was in England a couple years ago, you'd say, hey, I better watch out for that flock of sheep that's going to be coming across the road. And if any of you have traveled throughout England or Scotland, you know, like, you could come around the corner and there could be like 1,000 sheep standing in your way. Or if you saw this sign, you would know you should watch out for the older people who might be coming across the street. And if you were in certain parts of England, you'll see these almost everywhere, and you could assume there must be a lot of older people in England, right? Signs point to something beyond themselves. And I believe that this first one points to the character of what the kingdom of Jesus is like. Now, this story is so rich, and we could probably spend weeks on it, and we don't have time to do that today. But what I would like to do is I want to look at it in a couple different angles, because it has layers to it. So we want to hit the top layer. The top layer is the most obvious, and truthfully, that'd be enough for today. But I want to kind of dig a few layers deeper, sort of like an archaeologist trying to uncover what's underneath this story. So look back at it again with me. On the first layer of this story, I just want to point out some things that are somewhat obvious, right? There's a wedding taking place It's specifically a Jewish wedding. And Jewish weddings are a little bit different than most of the weddings that you and I are accustomed to attending today. I mean, our weddings last a few hours, maybe a half day. One of the most recent weddings that I was invited to lasted about 9 hours, and it was in Miami, Florida, and it was people. They had the wedding at the church, and because it's Florida and there's a lot of life and celebration in Miami, they actually everybody who was at the wedding walked a mile to the reception, and they had places where they stopped and had a party along the way. And it was a great time, but it didn't last that long. Jewish weddings sometimes lasted several days, maybe even up to a week, right? Can you imagine that? So in the midst of this week-long party, a terrible catastrophe occurs. The wine runs out, and there's a panic. Now, not only is this a situation that's really primed, if you're the host, right, for public embarrassment, but it was a real relational mishap. I mean, maybe we could think about it in the category of like missing your 25th wedding anniversary, just completely forgetting that it even happened. Or you set up a big party for your kid's 16th birthday and then you don't show up. It might even have been a little worse than that, because there are actually instances in the ancient world where one family sued the other because the wine ran out too soon. Not a great way to start the in-law relationships, right? So here's what happens, right? We have a problem. It's not the most significant problem in the world, but it is a real problem. And on this very basic level, I relate to this story because I have problems, right? I've got problems. I mean, they're not the most significant problems in the world, but they're often significant enough to me. I mean, how many of you here have problems, right? Okay, there's a few of you who I can tell you still have a problem because you're challenged with honesty, right? You're honestly challenged, right? We all have problems. I mean, 2014, for a lot of people I know, was a brutal year. It's a tough year. I just heard, Gloria mention a few minutes ago. She knows a lot of people that are hurting. And even if that hasn't been the case for you this past year, I'm sure there have been situations in your life when you have had a problem. But here's the thing. Most people, when they hit a problem in their life, they think about it like a roadblock. I just moved a little while ago to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and not long after we moved in, they blocked the road that led from our house to the main highway to fix a bridge. It was a roadblock, and it said, don't go down that way. And the first time I came up to it, I said, well, I don't know where I'm supposed to go. I hit a roadblock. Until I started looking around, and then I saw another sign. And what sign usually comes along with the road closed sign? Do you know? Detour, yeah. See, a lot of times we hit problems in our life, and they look like roadblocks, but really what I have come to see in my experience of life in the kingdom of God is that roadblocks are usually detours. They're usually detours. See, we can see a problem as an impediment or as an opportunity for Christ's intervention. And I can tell you that in this story, there's two kinds of people. There's people who encountered this situation and there was a panic because they saw it as a roadblock, and Mary saw it as an opportunity. Well, what do detours do? We all know they take us down a new path. They force us on a road we wouldn't normally go on. A lot of times it takes longer, and it's bumpier and windier, but it takes us to new places, and we see things we wouldn't normally see, and we would have never gone that way had we not had to. Problems are a roadblock or a detour. They're an impediment or an opportunity. And Mary is one of the first people to notice this problem, and immediately she decides that Jesus is the best solution. Now, Jesus is not the person that most people would turn to for a problem like this one, but she does. And Jesus is a bit hesitant at first, but soon after he decides he'll intervene on behalf of this family and his mother, and he turns the water into wine. So at this very basic level, this story is a reminder. It's a reminder to all of us that Jesus has the power to perform miracles, to intervene, that he cares, and he can help intersect with the problems that we face. In fact, miracles as a whole in the New Testament should always remind us that Jesus can do that, because I cannot think of a miracle that didn't start with a problem. But let's take the story down a slightly deeper level. And I want to zero in on this initial interaction between Jesus and his mother. When she comes to him and asks him, hey, she says, Jesus, the wine has run out. And Jesus says to her, woman, my time has not yet come. Now, just want to clear up something here before you have a chance to think that Jesus is being demeaning of his mother by referring to her as a woman. This term is actually in Greek a kind, polite expression. It's the same way that Jesus refers to his mother on the cross when he's telling John to take care of her. It's how he refers to her. But I want to look at her response there. In spite of the fact that Jesus moved away from intervening in this situation, she says to the servants, whatever he tells you to do, do it. So there are three important things going on here. I just want to help us notice them really quickly. First, in that moment, Mary displays the confidence she has in the character of Jesus. She's completely confident in his character. She trusts that Jesus will do whatever is best and should be done in the circumstance. Right? She knows what she hopes he will do. She comes to him and asks. She hopes he'll fix it. She hopes he'll intervene. But she ultimately trusts what he decides to do. Whatever he tells you to do, do it. And now, it's out of her hands. She's yielded it over. We have a word for that, and it's called faith. It's a picture of faith. But as we press in on it here, we see a picture really of what biblical faith is about, because biblical faith is not passive. There's a lot of people who encounter situations in life, and when they come at it through the lens of faith, they think that means they sit still and do nothing. Biblical faith, look at Mary here, is persistent initiative. Biblical faith is bold determination. It's a fiery hope in the direction that you are trusting for. Our faith should be like Mary's here. I mean, think about what she does. She presses in on Jesus, and then she trusts. She presses in and trusts. I think this is one of the best pictures of the sort of the divine dance of the relationship between God's action and our action in the Bible. God can act, and so can we. And the reason we can act, the reason we can press, the reason we can lean in faith, is because of what I said, number one, the location of what our faith is in. We can trust that Jesus will do whatever is best in the circumstance. So this should be really emboldening to us, right? When we encounter a situation, a problem, a detour where we want to see a breakthrough or an exercise of God's power. We don't disengage, we engage. We don't retreat, we entreat. We lean in and trust. You lean in and trust with your kids. You lean in and trust in your marriage. You lean in and trust at your job. You lean in and trust when you feel like God is prompting you to take a step. You lean in and trust. I married into a bike family. My wife's dad has got several bikes, and my wife has been riding a motorcycle since she was 10 years old. You can probably look at me, and that would be surprising to you that I would have married into that kind of family. But when just a little bit after we got married, we were over at my wife's father's house, and she kind of saw his bike over there, and she said, "Hey, Dad, I want to go for a ride." So they went out, went for a ride, and they came back, and she said, "Hey, hon, you ought to go." And I'm in a kind of a doubly bad situation now because I just have had my wife show me up, right? And now her dad's watching me waver about what I'm going to do. So in my younger days, when I was less confident in my manhood, I knew I just had to go. So I got on the bike, I strapped on the hat, and we take off down the road, 60 miles an hour. And And from the moment that we went over the first hill, I was already freaking out about this. And here's the real problem, okay? I don't know where to hold on. Like, I don't think I've ever even rode a motorcycle in my life up to this point. There's no seat belt. And, her dad's in front of me, and I don't really want to do that, right? Especially with how petrified I feel. So the only choice I have, right, is that little bar behind me. So I'm holding on, and, that's not a real stable position when you're going 60 miles an hour. So we're going down the road, and we come up to a curve. And I can see that the bike that was going this way starts to go this way as we lean into the curve. And I'm just thinking, we're just going to lean right into the pavement. And so I do the thing that any normal, clear-thinking person would do in a moment like that. I try to lean back the other way. And immediately, her dad hits the brakes and slows down. He turns around and says, "Chris, you never lean away from the curve." So we get back to the house, and he said, "Yeah, Chris, never do that again, never do that again." He said, "You think that when you're going 60 miles an hour around a curve, that the safest thing to do is to lean away. That actually puts you in the least safe place. When life throws you a curve, the best thing to do is to lean in faith and trust." We see that in Mary here. Lean in and trust. Press in and trust. And that kind of faith, it spills over. I mean, it can't but not spill over. Look with me at verses 5 and verses 7. Verses 5 and verses 7. You see, Mary's confidence, it's her faith that carries the servants in following Jesus' instructions. Whatever he tells you to do, do it. Right? I mean, can you imagine these servants? They have no idea who Jesus is. He's never done a miracle before. He was invited to the wedding. They were just servants serving the wedding. I mean, they have no experience to know that if they do this, that anything is going to happen, right? So can you imagine them? Mary says, whatever he tells you to do, do it. He says, go grab those pots, fill them with water, take some out of there, and take it to the head waiter. Right? So the servants are walking down the hall. They're taking water to the head waiter, whose problem is that he has no wine. Right? That's like ripe for getting fired. So they're walking down the hall, and just imagine this, right? They're walking, it's still water. They're walking, it's still water. They get to the head waiter, they turn it over to the head waiter, it's still water. The head waiter picks it up and looks at it, it's still water. The head waiter takes a drink, and it's wine. This whole way, the servants have been riding on Mary's faith, but now I bet they have a substantial amount of faith of their own. At the end of the story, we know that it was at this moment, interesting, that the disciples put their faith in him. And I bet those servants did too. It's not a bad reminder for Mary. Whatever he tells you to do, do it. But there's more, a slightly deeper layer. What I find interesting here is how Jesus chooses to respond. I mean, especially when you think of all the options he had to turn water into wine. I mean, there's probably bottles and sleeves scattered all over this wedding. I mean, he could have just, magically filled them up. Nobody would have even known. He could have told them to grab all those bottles and fill them with water and turn them into wine. He could have taken the pots that were likely in the kitchen already filled with water and turned them into wine. Instead, he chose one of the more difficult ways to deal with this challenge. Go and get these pots. Now, these pots were pots that sat by the door, and they held 20 to 30 gallons of water each. I mean, we're talking some big, big vessels here, very heavy. You see, these pots sat by the door, and they would have been there for when people came in from their travels, and they were particularly dirty, and they would wash their feet. And they were also there for before and after eating food, right? So this is it's kind of where people washed and got rid of their germs. And so those were those vessels were. They had a religious element to them, which is much too much to get into today. But so on one level, these vessels are as ordinary as possible, but they're in kind of the gross section of ordinary life. We could compare them to almost like a sink or a toilet or a trash can, right? I mean, if you're a mom and you're like freaked out by going to the play place at Christiana Mall at this time of year, I mean, can you imagine the germs after a week of people eating and drinking at a wedding, hundreds of them washing in these pots? Jesus says, grab those pots and fill them with water, and without even a touch, he turned a container that symbolized the leftover of life into a vessel of joy. I believe that one of the reasons that Jesus chose this way of conducting his first miracle was a sign that Jesus wants to deposit a transformation of joy in our everyday life. A wedding is a common thing. Jesus wants to deposit a transformation of joy in our everyday life from our everyday life. I just want to say that again because I want it to really sit with us. Jesus wants to deposit a transformation of joy in your everyday life from your everyday life. He's not looking to help you escape from your life. He's looking to transform the circumstances that you face in your life. Jesus wants to take your everyday spouse. And by the way, you are too. Your everyday children, your everyday church, your everyday job, your everyday time, your everyday faith. He wants to take the everyday and deposit joy into it. And he wants to do it with abundance. John says that the pots of water were filled to the brim, and when the head waiter tasted it, he was amazed because the best had been saved till last. Finally, we get to the bottom of this story, and we know that this is a story about Jesus' power to intervene in our life, particularly when it's matched with faith. This is a power that's not for a special part of life. It's a transformative power for all of life. And yet the question still haunts me when I think about this story is, why? Why did Jesus do this? You see, when we get back to the beginning of the encounter, Mary comes to Jesus, right? She asked him to do something, and what does Jesus tell her? At first he says, no. My time has not yet come. You see, because if Jesus grants her request, what's it mean? It means his time has come. It means that now, all of a sudden, people are going to start to know who he is, to know what he's up to know what he's capable of, and literally for him, his time is ticking away. And it won't stop, his clock won't stop, until the hand reaches Good Friday and Jesus goes to the cross. You can maybe understand why he would have been a little hesitant to start the clock. But we don't know if it was a few moments or a few minutes. But somehow when Jesus steps back and he looks at the whole of his life, and at first his impulse is not to grant her request, he considers the situation in front of him and he goes ahead with it. At a wedding, to make some wine. Why? Well, if you step back from this story and you look around it in the book of John, I think we start to get a picture. See, in John chapter 1, there's an encounter there between John the Baptist and Jesus. And John the Baptist says to Jesus, he says about Jesus, I am not worthy to untie his sandal. Now, for a long time, I thought that that was basically John's way of being humble. That's how I read it. Maybe you read it that way too. See, but the truth is, when these writers of the New Testament were writing these things, I mean, the Old Testament was so lodged in their memory. And so there are so many times when they say something, and we look at it one way, but they meant something different with it. To untie the sandal is actually a reference back to the story of Ruth and Boaz. And in the Old Testament, when a woman lost her husband and there was no one to redeem the line, there was a clause called the kinsman redeemer. where a groom would come and would step into the place of a husband that had died so that a family line might continue. And there's a lot that is into that process, but one of the things that happened in that process is when you identified the kinsman redeemer unloosed the sandal. John is telling us something here. He's saying, this is the one that has come to redeem the bride. John chapter 2, what do we have? We have this story of the wedding in Cana of Galilee. John chapter 3, there is a discussion there in which Jesus refers to this grand story that he's a part of, and he uses this imagery of a groom and a bride. John chapter 4, Jesus meets a woman at the well. And if you remember that story, as in his interactions with the woman has had 5 husbands, right? Now she has a guy who's not her husband. And Jesus comes to her as the 7th man. Now in the Bible, the number 7 is the number of completion. She's had a lot of relationships that have not worked out. Finally, she has found the man she should have been looking for all along. Matter of fact, if you keep going through the book of John, you will find these images of nuptial love all throughout it. Of the union, of comparing the union of a husband and a wife, and the coming forth of children to what God is doing in the world. If you get to John chapter 16, Jesus is coming into the moment of the passion, of the cross. And you know what he compares it to? Giving birth. And if you step back and you say, what's the most predominant image that is used in the New Testament to describe the relationship of Christ and the church? How do the New Testament writers try to get at the core of what that is and how God postures himself to us and how he feels about his people? What image do they use? Marriage. Family. If you take it to the end of the story, how does God say we're going to wrap things up? The image he uses, a great wedding feast. Now, it is hard on 2 levels for us to sometimes get our mind around this because, honestly, the state of marriage in our society is so marred. It is really hard for us to try to even conceive of how God could have meant anything like that. But deep in our soul, we know what it's supposed to have been. And that's what God has in mind. It's hard often, I think, on another level, and I confess I've had seasons where this has been hard for me, particularly sometimes for guys more than women, but not all the case. It's hard to think about our interaction, our life, our relationship with God as a husband and a wife. That's a hard thing to get our mind around. I mean, I've talked to a lot of guys, it just feels squishy, right? But I remember a number of years ago, I was talking with a young man who, he was a smart guy, he was a tough guy, and he was really trying to come to terms his relationship with God. And like in any conversation you do often as a pastor, you're talking about a lot of different categories of life in one sitting. And I remember sitting with him, and we were talking about all of this, and I just looked at him and I said to him, what difference would it have made if you knew that your dad really loved you? And he put his hands in his face, and he just wept. And I wouldn't be telling you that story this morning if I had not asked that question to tons of young men who had the same response. And I then asked that question to tons of young women who so wish they could have said, I really knew that.
You see, deep in our soul, we have this sense that there's supposed to be a love given to us that comes out of this love between two people that brings forth this life in this love. And we know it, we know it, we know it, and we miss it, and we miss it, and we miss it. And that is why God chooses to ensconce this image as the image to describe how he looks at you. For as flawed and as struggling as our human attempts at this are, God always points back to say that there's a husband, that there's a parent who loves you in all the ways that you know you're supposed to be. And I think that's why Jesus starts here at a wedding, because that's the image he brings us to at the end. Father, we come to you this morning. And Lord, I don't think I have really said anything new today. There are some days, Jesus, where what we just need to do is we need to reproclaim the deposits of truth that we know. And would you stare into the depths of our soul, even into the toughest of souls, and declare your love to us. We know that Jesus, by moving forward with this miracle, that he enacted a process in which he would give the ultimate demonstration of your love by going to the cross. And you would vindicate that love by raising him from the dead. Make us complete, Father. Meet us in our problems, in our detours, and in our struggles, as we long for the union that we were only meant to have when we come back together with you.